Morning in the small town of Fairmont always carried a soft golden light, as if time there moved more slowly than anywhere else. In the expansive kitchen of her century-old heritage home, Maggie Whitmore sat at the oak table, one hand cradling a teacup tarnished by years, the other gently tracing the edge of a hand-embroidered tablecloth. Outside the window, the branches of the ancient oak swayed in the early breeze. That tree had stood there long before she was born, its roots sunk deep into the earth, its gnarled trunk bearing the marks of many harsh winters. Maggie often said the oak was part of her family's lifeblood, standing there like an old sentinel, silent but never abandoning its post. A tarnished brass key gleamed faintly in the sunlight on the kitchen wall, just beside the rack of kettles and cups. It no longer opened any lock, but Maggie kept it there as a reminder of ownership and legacy, something no one had the right to touch without permission. She took a sip of tea, listening to the steady ticking of the wall clock. The stillness was so complete she could hear the faint rustle of leaves falling in the backyard. Then the shrill ring of the telephone cut through the quiet like a blade slicing silk. Maggie startled slightly, and before she picked up the receiver, her hand instinctively reached toward the brass key, fingertips brushing its cool metal. Just a moment, but enough to sharpen her gaze. "It's me, Carrie, Mom." Her daughter-in-law's voice came through the line, trembling as though she'd had to take a deep breath before speaking. I just saw Uncle Rick at the Riverbend Hotel." Maggie set her teacup down with a soft, deliberate sound. "I thought he was on a business trip?" "No, Mom, he wasn't alone. Vanessa was with him." The name hung in the air, thickening the silence. "Vanessa, Carrie's sister." Maggie's voice remained even. "Are you sure? I took a few photos. They're blurry, they were far away." Carrie's breathing quickened. "But once you see them, you'll know." A soft ting announced a new message. Maggie opened her phone and looked at the screen. The pictures were grainy, but the silhouettes were unmistakable. Rick's tall frame, the familiar tilt of his head when he smiled. Beside him, Vanessa, dark hair spilling loose, her hand resting lightly on his arm. For several seconds Maggie said nothing. Outside, the oak's branches stirred in the wind, the leaves whispering like someone speaking just out of earshot. Carrie's voice broke the silence. "Mom, are you okay?" Maggie drew in a slow breath, her eyes fixed on the oak beyond the window. "I'm fine. Thank you for telling me. Do you want me to do anything?" "Not yet. Just keep quiet. Don't let anyone know you called me." Her tone was calm, almost gentle, but each word was placed with precision. She ended the call and set the phone back on the table. Once again, Maggie's gaze returned to the oak. Its shadow spread wide over the ground, sheltering like an embrace. In her eyes, the morning's soft light had given way to something more complex. She lifted her tea again, took another sip, but no longer tasted it. Her hand on the table tightened slightly, then released, like a breath drawn before the opening move of a long game. Then she smiled, not with joy, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows she's about to make a move her opponent won't see coming. When her eyes left the window, they were no longer the eyes of an older woman on a peaceful morning. They were the eyes of someone preparing for a fight she had no intention of losing. The next day, Maggie adjusted her routine with quiet precision, careful not to draw attention. She suggested changing the time she cleaned Rick's office from early morning to midday, claiming that daylight makes it easier to see the dust. However, she could observe the place while he was away. She concealed a mini camera no bigger than a coin in the pocket of her apron, alongside a dust cloth and a bottle of glass cleaner. The first time she entered the office after Rick had just left, she stood still for a few seconds, listening to the fading sound of his footsteps in the hallway. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting the shadow of the oak tree outside across the desk. Maggie began cleaning, but every movement was deliberate. She opened the bookcase door, choosing a spot between two thick hardcovers, hidden, yet with a perfect view of both the desk and the drawers. As she fixed the camera, her fingers trembled slightly, her heartbeat quickened, and her ears strained for the slightest sound. She released a slow, quiet breath when she heard Rick's car engine start in the parking lot. That night, after the household had fallen asleep, Maggie opened her laptop and reviewed the footage. Rick sat at his desk, opening a drawer and taking out several large envelopes, one holding a thick stack of papers. He read for a long time, folded them, slipped them into his briefcase, and his eyes narrowed as though calculating his next move. Maggie rewound the footage, noted the time, and matched it to his travel schedule. She didn't stop there. "Why do you ask?" Maggie smiled. "Oh, I just noticed it's been a while since she's come by." The conversation ended there, but Maggie had caught the faint thread of uncertainty in Carrie's voice. That same afternoon, while sorting the mail, Maggie found an envelope between the water and electricity bills. It was from an insurance company, listing her as the policyholder, but the beneficiary was Vanessa. The signature in the consent box looked like hers. Still, the strokes were rigid, lacking the familiar loops and softness, a carefully executed forgery, but not good enough to fool her. Maggie sat down at the kitchen table and dialed the company's hotline, her voice gentle, playing the part of a customer, just confirming the details of a recent policy. After a few standard questions, the representative cheerfully replied, "Yes, the life insurance policy number is under your name, beneficiary Vanessa, signed 3 weeks ago." Maggie repeated, 3 weeks ago? That's strange, I was in Vermont then. The reply was untroubled. "The file shows your signature on record." She ended the call, feeling a slow chill settle inside her. She remembered more than 20 years ago, when a relative had used legal but ruthless means to seize her aunt's home after her passing. One small clause in the paperwork had stripped the family of everything. Since then, Maggie had guarded all inheritance documents with obsessive care. And she knew, once someone reached for a piece of an estate, they wouldn't stop until they had taken it all. That evening, Vanessa appeared in the kitchen while Maggie was pouring tea. "Want me to help with that?" Vanessa asked sweetly, though her eyes seemed to study her. Maggie didn't turn right away, answering softly, "No need, thank you," before continuing to pour, her hand tightening around the silver teapot's handle for just a moment, long enough for a watchful observer to notice. Another night, Rick came home late. Maggie had switched off the living room lights and waited in the dark. The door opened, and he hung his coat on the rack, exhaling softly, hair tousled and tie loosened like a man returning from an evening that had nothing to do with work. For an instant, Maggie's eyes flashed with a sharp, cold anger, but she quickly bent down to pick up a cleaning rag, scrubbing the spot by the door as if she had been there purely for chores. Each passing day, Maggie fit another piece into her private puzzle. Every detail was stored away like a chess piece waiting to be moved, and she knew once she had enough, her next move would leave Rick and Vanessa with no way out. Afternoon in Fairmont felt heavier than usual, the clouds hanging low as if pressing down on the old heritage roof. Wind swept through the oak's canopy, the rustle a ceaseless murmur, half whisper, half warning. When Carrie stepped in, Maggie was in the kitchen, idly turning the silver teapot's handle. Her daughter-in-law looked restless, her eyes darting about as if afraid someone might overhear. Maggie gave her a look, motioning for her to sit. "Mom, I found something in Vanessa's things," Carrie began, her voice a little hoarse. "It has to do with Aunt Lillian." Maggie's hand stilled, though she didn't immediately meet Carrie's gaze. She set the teapot down, the metal's soft chime against wood cutting the air, then asked, "Your aunt's been gone for over 10 years. Why bring her up now?" Carrie produced a small Ziploc from her bag containing a glass vial with a faded label. "Digitalis. I found it in an old box. On the vial, there are Vanessa's fingerprints. And..." She hesitated before pulling out a stack of papers, printed emails. Vanessa once posted on a medical forum, asking for the safe dose of Digitalis for elderly heart patients. But the answer she saved wasn't about safety. It spelled out exactly what dosage could be fatal. The kitchen seemed to freeze. Maggie lifted her teacup but, instead of sipping, set it down sharply. The clean, crisp sound rang out, tea sloshing over the rim and onto the tablecloth. She reached for a napkin and began wiping the spill slowly, her breathing evening out, as though the simple motion could pull her emotions back under control. "When did you find this?" she asked. 2 days ago, Carrie said, her voice quieter. "I don't know if I believe it, but remember? Before Aunt Lillian died, Vanessa stayed with her for a week. Everyone thought she was caring for her, but now Carrie trailed off. Maggie straightened, her eyes fixed on the oak outside the window. Memory brought back the funeral. Lillian's serene face in a dark wooden coffin, the thick scent of lilies, the sound of wind across the cemetery. In a black dress, Vanessa hugged Maggie tightly, but now in hindsight, the embrace had been cold, lacking warmth. "Have you told anyone else?" Maggie asked, her gaze never leaving the tree. "No. I thought if this is true then Vanessa," again Carrie stopped short. "We won't tell anyone. Give me everything, both the vial and the emails." Maggie's voice was low, each word deliberate. Carrie nodded, as though relieved to pass the burden on. After she left, Maggie remained at the table, fingers tapping lightly on the wood, a habit from her calculating moments. She reached for the old brass key hanging in the kitchen corner, closing her hand around it. Cold. Unyielding. The feel of it brought back an old lesson. Those who dare touch blood and inheritance will never be forgiven. In her mind, an earlier property dispute surfaced. Years ago, she'd watched a relative be forced out of their home by a clause buried deep in legal language. Back then Maggie had been powerless. This time would be different. As night fell, the house grew still. Only the wind and the clock's steady tick remained. Maggie laid every evidence on the table. Rick's credit card statements, the blurred mini-camera footage, the insurance contract with the forged signature, and now the vial of digitalis alongside the printed emails. She slipped on gloves, placing each item into its envelope and sealing it carefully. Before putting them away, she called Patricia, her trusted lawyer, saying, "I'll need to see you soon. Bring your document lock bag." She didn't mention why phones could be listened to. When she was done, Maggie poured another cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the oak's shadow stretch long over the ground. The wind had grown stronger, the leaves shuddering violently, yet the trunk stood firm. She understood now this wasn't just about infidelity or money. If Vanessa truly had a hand in Lillian's death, this was a matter of survival. And in battles like that, defense alone would never do. She took a slow sip, letting the heat slide down her throat. A plan was already forming, not just to expose Rick and Vanessa, but to sever once and for all any chance they could strike again. This time Maggie would make the first move. And she would fight until there was nothing left to lose. The small conference room on the second floor of Thomas Grant's law office was awash in afternoon light, streaming through beige curtains and laying long streaks across the polished wood table. Rick sat at the head, in a dark blue suit and neatly knotted tie, the image of a businessman closing a favorable deal. Beside him, Vanessa sat with arms folded, her red dress striking against the gray wall, eyes bright as if she'd already taken a sip of victory. Maggie entered in a simple pale blue dress, hair neatly pinned, carrying a soft canvas bag that held only a few papers and a carefully wrapped silver teacup. She sat opposite Rick, her face serene, betraying neither anger nor strain. Thomas Grant flipped through the documents, his voice steady as he read the terms. Division of assets, ownership of the heritage home, investments, bank accounts. Each clause tilted sharply in Rick's favor, and to anyone looking on, it seemed that if Maggie signed, she would walk away with almost nothing. "I want this to be an amicable divorce," Rick said, his tone carrying a hint of condescension beneath its polite veneer. "There's no need to drag this out or make a spectacle of it, Maggie." She smiled faintly and nodded. "I want that too." When Thomas slid the file across to her, she didn't pore over it but skimmed as if reading a familiar menu. Vanessa leaned slightly toward Rick, the corner of her mouth lifting, her gaze flicking to him. The glance was quick, but it was enough to see the easy confidence of those convinced they'd already won. Maggie caught it, filed it away, yet her expression remained as soft as before. At the head of the table, Thomas's brow twitched when Maggie seemed far too compliant, as though something in the scene didn't quite add up. But he said nothing. He made notes, keeping the smooth process his client wanted. Maggie signed each page with a steady, clear hand, neither rushed nor hesitant. Each time she set her pen down, she tilted her head slightly as though rereading. When she was pacing her breath, holding her composure, keeping her mind sharp. The room was hushed except for the rustle of paper and the faint pen scrape on the page. When she finished the last signature, she placed the pen and slid the file back to Thomas. Rick lifted a hand as if to speak but settled on a courteous, "I think this is the best choice for all of us." Maggie answered with a thin smile, offering no argument. She rose, picked up her bag, and walked out with such unhurried calm that anyone watching would think she had accepted defeat. The door closed behind her, and Rick leaned toward Vanessa in that instant. Their eyes met, and the corners of their mouths curved into the kind of smile worn by people convinced the victory was already theirs. Vanessa whispered something that made Rick chuckle softly. At the same time, Thomas glanced briefly at them before focusing back on stacking the documents. In the empty hallway, Maggie walked on, her heels tapping a steady rhythm on the wooden floor. Near the front entrance she paused, opened her bag, and took a photo of the entire sign file with a quick, practiced motion. It was the set of terms Elaine Brooks, her attorney, had prepared in parallel, terms Rick and Vanessa had no idea existed. In them, the bloodline trust retained ownership of the house, the postnup protected most of the assets, and every voluntary signature today was simply part of luring the other side into complacency. She sent the photos and scans instantly via a secure app to Elaine, adding only the following: Begin Step 2. Elaine had been waiting months for this moment, with every document ready, even a temporary court order to block Rick from touching anything beyond what had already been confirmed as his. Slipping her phone back into the bag, Maggie's fingers brushed the old brass key, stroking it lightly as if to steady her heartbeat. She stepped out into the late sunlight without looking back. On the sidewalk, the wind carried the scent of dry leaves from the nearby park, children's laughter drifting from a distance, an odd contrast to the cold game just played upstairs. Maggie tightened her hold on the bag, and the cool weight of the key inside reminded her that the real contest had only just begun. The move she had made that day had placed Rick and Vanessa exactly where she wanted them. In the last light of day, she walked on, each step like a quiet count toward the moment the board would be turned. On Thursday afternoon, Rick was in his private office when his phone buzzed, Thomas Grant's name flashing on the screen. Thomas's voice was nothing like its usual steady, confident tone, slow, almost cautious. "Rick, there's something you need to know. The Whitmore house, it doesn't belong to you." Rick frowned. "What do you mean?" "We signed. The house is in a bloodline trust. It's been in Maggie's family for years, established long before you married her. And," Thomas paused as though choosing his words, "there's a postnup you signed back when you and Maggie reconciled. It states clearly that if one party commits adultery, that party forfeits any share of joint assets, aside from a minimal fixed amount." Rick's grip on the phone tightened, his pulse pounding. "You're joking." "I wish I were," Thomas said with a sigh. "And there's more. Elaine Brooks is Maggie's lawyer. She's already submitted all the evidence, receipts, photos, and—" Rick stopped listening. Heat surged to his face. Everything he'd been so sure he had in hand was crumbling piece by piece. In his mind came the image of Vanessa on the day of the divorce signing, the confident smile, the glance they had shared. All of it now felt like a farce. Across town, the last of the day's light filtered through thin curtains into Vanessa's tastefully arranged living room. She stood before the mirror, fixing her hair, when the landline rang. Her voice was honey smooth. "Hello." A dry male voice replied. "Vanessa Moore? This is the Fairfield County Police Department. We need you to cooperate in an investigation regarding insurance fraud and an unusual death." Vanessa froze, then gave a soft laugh. "There must be some mistake. I have nothing to—" A loud knock on the door cut her off. The air in the room went still. She turned toward the door, her whole body tensing. It was a strange kind of silence, the breath before the storm. A second knock came, harder this time, followed by a shout. "Police! Open the door!" Her eyes darted around the room, her hands trembling. She knew the windows were locked, and the hallway was narrow, no escape. Her gaze flicked to the purse on the chair, where a small notebook lay inside, filled with transactions she never wanted anyone to see. But it was already too late. The door burst open, and 2 officers were on her in seconds, handcuffing her with efficient force. "You have no right," she yelled, her breathing ragged, eyes scanning like a trapped animal for one last chance. They read her rights, listing the life insurance policy in Maggie's name with her as the beneficiary, the forged signature, and the emails from her computer detailing lethal digitalis doses. Vanessa caught sight of a man in a suit standing at the end of the hallway, a plainclothes investigator she didn't recognize, holding a thick file, his gaze cold and unwavering. Out in the parking lot Rick had just pulled in. He hadn't even stepped out of the car when he saw Vanessa being led away in cuffs. The wind carried the faint metallic clink of the handcuffs. Vanessa glanced back at him, her eyes a wild mix of shock and hatred, as if she wanted to scream something, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the police car's engine. Rick stood motionless, neither lifting a hand nor saying a word. Another officer approached and handed him a sealed envelope. "Mr. Rick Whitmore? This is a subpoena. We need to ask you a few questions about recent transactions and joint accounts with Vanessa Moore." Rick took it, his hand trembling slightly, eyes dropping to the bright red court seal. When the officers left, he remained alone in the empty lot, hearing nothing but the whip of the wind and the scrape of dry leaves across the pavement. He felt like he was standing on a stage where the lights had just gone out, leaving only darkness and a hollow echo. His vision blurred. Whether from the sun or something pressing behind his eyes, he couldn't tell. "What have I done?" he murmured, almost to himself, before turning away, shoulders slightly hunched, like a man who had just realized he'd destroyed everything and there was no way back. Driving home, he switched on the radio but heard meaningless background noise. His mind went to the Whitmore house, to the old oak tree whose shade he would never stand under again. Meanwhile, in the Heritage kitchen, Maggie sat at the oak table, her hand resting on the silver teacup. Afternoon light filtered through the oak's leaves, casting their shadows on the floor like the grain of time itself. She opened her phone and read a message from Elaine. Step 3 complete. Everything is as planned. Vanessa arrested, Rick's claims void. Maggie took a sip, letting the heat fill her mouth, and gave the smallest nods. She looked out the window at the oak leaves stirring gently in the wind, feeling that everything had returned to its rightful place. Outside, the wind blended with the steady tick of the clock, slow, sure, just like how she had played this game from the beginning. And now, the board lay fully turned in her favor. News of Vanessa's arrest and Rick's financial collapse spread through Fairmont like fire across dry fields. People whispered, speculated, and dissected every detail. Still, the noise faded once the two vanished from town. Rick sold off his one valuable luxury car, liquidated a few expensive belongings for quick cash, and slipped away without a word of goodbye. Vanessa was escorted back to the city, her expression cold. However, her eyes betrayed unease at facing a long stretch of court dates and the prospect of years in prison. The Whitmore house returned wholly to Maggie, not just in legal terms, but in the sense of safety she had safeguarded with months of steady patience and calculated moves. Rooms once filled with suspicion, hallways where a hidden mini camera had quietly recorded, were now open to sunlight and the easy sound of footsteps. Maggie began small restorations in the kitchen, new curtains, the oak table polished, not for show, but to warm the space again for those seeking it. Dan appeared on the porch one October afternoon with a basket of apples from his parents' orchard. Carrie was with him, their hands intertwined, speaking more through glances than words. The long nights when Carrie lay awake, haunted by the image of her sister with Rick, had begun to fade. Dan had chosen to stay, not only to apologize for the quiet suspicions he had once harbored, but to thank Maggie for silently protecting his family when it seemed everything might fall apart. Maggie welcomed them in and poured tea, her smile warm in a way it hadn't been in a long time. She looked at them as if seeing for the first time that they were a family. As winter approached, Maggie turned to a new project, converting the garden outbuilding into a temporary refuge for women in crisis or escaping abusive relationships. She started a small charitable fund with a few old friends, pooling money and supplies. Maggie didn't share much about her reasons, but everyone quietly understood the story behind her decision. In the early days, only one young woman and her minor son came, settling into a room with a window that framed the great oak. Gradually, by discreet word of mouth, more arrived. Maggie kept her rule. No questions about the past, only to help find safety in the present and a chance for the future. In the mornings she would see them sharing tea, their laughter mingling with the smell of fresh baking. At night the yellow glow from the outbuilding spilled across the cold yard, a small pocket of peace. Each time she passed beneath the oak, Maggie touched its trunk, feeling the strength in the old bark, knowing its deep-rooted resilience had somehow become her own. That Thanksgiving the Whitmore house was alive with warmth. Carrie brought fresh pumpkin pie, Dan tended the fire, and the women staying in the outbuilding set the table in the garden beneath the oak's sheltering branches. The early winter wind slid through, but the sunlight was still golden, filtering through the last leaves and shattering shimmering patches across the table. Maggie stepped out carrying the silver teapot with her through every storm. She poured tea into each cup, steam curling up to mingle with the scents of pie and dry leaves. When everyone was seated, she stood momentarily, her eyes moving over each face, Dan and Carrie, the young women, the child playing with the Whitmore family's aging dog. Lifting her cup, her voice low but warm, she said, "The wind can be strong, but when the roots run deep, nothing can pull them out." For a heartbeat, it felt as if even the wind paused to listen, and then every hand lifted a cup in return. Above them, the oak's leaves rustled softly, as if agreeing. In that moment, Maggie knew the house, the land, and her legacy had weathered the storm, and had become a sanctuary for more souls than she had ever imagined. Winter afternoons in Fairmont carried a pale, cold light that lent even the most familiar things a muted, somber hue. Maggie's hands moved quickly in the kitchen, stacking teacups into the cupboard. However, her thoughts had drifted back to her last encounter with Vanessa at the police station. Under the sterile glow of fluorescent lights, just before she was led away, Vanessa had leaned in, lips pressed tight before releasing words barely louder than breath. "You think this is over?" It hadn't needed explanation. Maggie knew it wasn't just the venom of defeat, a veiled promise of a day she might return. She hadn't shivered. A quiet vigilance had rooted itself deep within her, like the oak outside stood unyielding through every storm. That evening, Dan and Carrie came for dinner. Carrie helped ladle the beef stew into serving bowls while Dan fed more wood to the fire. As the food was set down, Maggie poured tea, steam from the silver pot curling into a soft, hazy veil between them. She looked at the two of them, her gaze free of the sharp edge it had carried in past months, though a certain steel still lay beneath. "There's something I want to say," she began, her tone as calm as if speaking about the weather. "If she comes back, I'll be ready." Carrie glanced up, momentarily meeting her mother-in-law's eyes before giving a slight, deliberate nod, asking nothing more. Dan placed his hand firmly over Maggie's, a silent vow that he and Carrie would stand with her. The matter needed no further discussion. After dinner, while Carrie washed the dishes, Dan helped Maggie stack a few piles of books in the living room. Before leaving, both embraced her on the porch, holding on for a long moment. Maggie watched them walk away, their figures shrinking along the leaf-strewn road, then turned back inside and stepped out into the garden. The oak loomed against the night, its bare branches reaching into a gray sky, but the trunk stood solid, a testament to a strength nothing could shake. She placed her hand on its rough bark, fingers tracing the ridged lines, feeling herself in them. The wind swept through, cold and sharp, but the earth was still warm at the tree's base, and the roots ran deep. She smiled, not from comfort, but from knowing that whatever the future brought, she would be strong enough to meet it head-on. Maggie Whitmore's story is more than a quiet, calculated tale of retribution. It's a journey of resilience, intelligence, and self-respect. In the face of betrayal, she didn't explode or lose control. Instead, she chose the patient path of gathering evidence, using the law and protecting her family's legacy. She understood true victory wasn't about striking back in a burst of emotion, but letting her opponents trap themselves through their own reckless choices. The deeper meaning here is clear. When life throws you into turmoil, staying calm and crafting a brilliant plan gives you a greater advantage than anger. The second lesson is the value of preparation. Maggie didn't wait for a crisis to come knocking. She had already fortified her position through the bloodline trust, the postnup. She trusted allies like her lawyer Elaine. This reminds us that preparedness isn't pessimism. It's a way to safeguard yourself in what matters most. The third lesson, perhaps the one that resonates deepest, is how Maggie chose to end her story, not mired in bitterness, but by turning her victory into an opportunity to help other women. She showed that when we overcome hardship, our greatest strength is using our hard-earned wisdom to create positive change for others. And throughout it all, the image of the oak stands as a reminder. No matter how fierce the storm, if the roots run deep, nothing can uproot you. It symbolizes steadfastness, family ties, and an unshakable sense of dignity. If this story has inspired you or given you something to reflect on, share your thoughts in the comments, give it a like so more people can discover it, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story, each one carrying a message that might change the way you see life.